wonderful speakers who I will introduce in a second. We're very interested in many topics at the Kennedy School, but the Indo-Pacific is one that we really wanted to privilege just because it's become so central. I'm Edward Cunningham. I run our Asia Energy and Sustainability Initiative at the school and also our China programs at the Ash Center. And I'm really delighted to be able to moderate this discussion. And it's hosted by the Rajawali Foundation Institute for Asia at the Ash Center and co-sponsored by the Developer Center and also the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. Also importantly supported by Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So we have two of our lovely partners here, Charles and Doris from TECO Boston. If anyone's interested in meeting them, they're here. And want to talk about also Taiwan policy itself directly. In terms of housekeeping, as we do in all of our events, we acknowledge the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. And we also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Also part of housekeeping, today's discussion is being recorded. You will receive a link if you're registered, which I think all of you are, to the recording afterward, and the video will be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. In terms of format, what we're going to do is keep it pretty unstructured, meaning we're going to have kind of a fireside chat effectively between the speakers. I'll start us off with some questions to get them to kind of compare and contrast views. And then turn to all of you for a good 30 or 40 minutes of Q&A. Just in terms of intros, Dr. Ely Ratner is currently a principal at the Marathon Initiative, which is a really interesting bipartisan think tank effectively. They're doing serious research. It's something he can also speak to if he'd like, and have questions on that. He's also a senior advisor at Clarion Strategies on the private sector side. He, most importantly for this discussion, served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the Pentagon from the entire Biden administration, 2021 to last year. He was also a Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden when he was Vice President. He also worked in many other positions, Office of Chinese and Mongolian Affairs at State, U.S. Senate, Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Outside of government, Dr. Ratner also has worked as the EVP and Director of Studies at the Center for New American Security. Most of you know, probably. He was a senior fellow for China Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, associate political scientist at RAND. So he's done many different things, which is why I love hearing from him. And lastly, he received his BA from Princeton and PhD in political science from Berkeley. Let me also introduce my lovely friend and colleague, Professor Mark Rule. He is, most importantly, one of my favorite people at Harvard University. So I think regardless of everything he's done in his life, the most important accolade is he's earned that. He's particularly, at least this morning, that's his highest accolade in my mind. So I love Mark. He is the Henry Stimson Professor at the law school, where he specializes in international trade, as probably most of you know, in international economic law. Faculty Director of Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies, and faculty co-director of the Berkeley Klein Center for Internet and Society, which most of you also probably know. Mark has done many interesting things as well. So he served in multiple positions at USTR, the agency review team for the Biden-Harris transition team. He's been a consultant at McKinsey on the private sector side. He's been an economist at the World Bank, a law clerk. And in his free time, he graduated from Harvard College, Yale Law School, and Oxford as a some little thing called Rhodes Scholar. So to set the scene, we are, I think, meeting at a time of unusual strategic flux in the global system. Over the past decade, and we've talked a lot about this today, the Indo-Pacific has moved from being what some people argued more of a regional priority to what I would think is more the central theater of global geopolitics. So I think what we're seeing is not just competition, but a reconfiguration of how power is exercised across military posture, economic statecraft, technology policy, and what I'm also quite interested in, alliance design in the region and globally. So the U.S. has responded with a series of initiatives that reflect that shift, or deepening alliances on the one hand. We had Steve Yates talking about that very recently from Heritage Foundation, expanding security partnerships like ALPIS, and experimenting with new forms of economic engagement, but also economic pressure, right, through tariffs, obviously. At the same time, China, its abilities, capabilities, ambitions have continued to evolve. But I think obviously fundamental questions remain unresolved. So what exactly, this is what we're going to talk about. What exactly is the strategic objective of US policy in the Indo-Pacific? What does success really look like? How do we reconcile sort of deterrence, competition, and cooperation in a region where economic interdependence is obviously so deep? And what are the implications for a place like Taiwan, its people, its society, and its economy? So I think today's discussion brings two really complementary perspectives. Ely is a practitioner, well-trained at Berkeley, and he's coming from the center, really, of US defense strategy. And Mark, who's also been a practitioner, brings a legal and political economy lens, I think, to how strategy is implemented and constrained. So I think our goal, lastly, is to sort of think carefully about what comes next, in a way, where strategy is coherent, where tensions remain, and sort of what trade-offs lie ahead. So just kind of to level set a little bit of the context. With that, Ely, I'm going to turn to you first. Can you just to kind of set us off, what do you think is the real core objective of US Indo-Pacific strategy today? And how has it evolved? What does success look like to you now, moving forward? Because one critique is that the strategy is relatively coherent. This is give you credit on the security side, but is less so on the economic side. So do you agree with that? Is there a gap? Is it a temporary gap? Should we fix it? Let's just to get us going. What is the actual goal?
Okay, great. No, big question to start with. And first of all, let me just say thank you to Edward and
of course
the Harvard Kennedy School and all of you for coming out today. Looking forward to the discussion. Edward's been putting me through the ringer already. Absolutely. It's only noon and I've already had 17 meetings. And, right. But great discussions. And I'm glad we have 90 minutes because give us a chance to really get into this. So first of all, what are the objectives of the United States in the Indo-Pacific? The way that has been articulated, beginning with the first Trump administration through the Biden administration, has been around this conception of a free and open Indo-Pacific in which the United States retains access to the military waterways, the politics and the economics and the markets and the technology of the 21st century, which will be largely written in the Indo-Pacific. So I think it is about maintaining America's role and traditional role in being able to reap the benefits of openness and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific. So that, by and large, is the goal. There are obviously military and security elements associated with that, which we can absolutely get into. But I think the critique which you made is right, that the security element of that has been stronger and more prominent than the economic element per se. And that's a problem because we do need a more coordinated, synchronized strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And frankly, even for security folks, I think there is recognition that the economics are the lifeblood of the region. And that's what, if you sit down with the leaders there, that's what they care about more than anything. And it was interesting for me in my role at the Pentagon, having the opportunity to travel with Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin at the time. And we would meet with leaders when we went around the region, whether it was in Australia or Singapore or Indonesia or India and elsewhere. And, you know, they'd want to talk shop about security matters, but what they would really want to talk about is economics and development. And they would constantly be reminding the Secretary of Defense to say, hey, we love our security partnership with the United States, but when you go back to Washington, you got to remind folks that America needs to step up in terms of economic leadership. And that has been a constant concern for folks like myself. And it's no secret that the domestic politics in the United States have made that harder rather than easier over time for the US to lead in that way. But as Mark and others can describe, America has all the assets to do that, should it want to do so, in terms of the strength of our private sector and the role of our economy in the world and in the region. So I think it is a deficit, and you often do hear from partners, oh, we think about the United States as the security partner and China as the economic partner. I think that's neither inevitable nor good for the United States. So I think bringing forward a more coherent and more proactive economic relations strategy is going to have to be part of where we go, but it's not high on the agenda right now. And obviously, the Trump administration's version of that is very different from anything we've tried in the past. So happy to talk about that as well. But I think it's a good critique to say we still need to step forward on the economic front.
Thanks for that. So, Mark, let me just turn to you for a second. You know, IPEF was an attempt in a way to try to engage some of these issues, right? On the Biden administration's from their perspective. I think and people from Taiwan can often weigh in on this. I mean, I think it was sort of viewed as a bit for weak in terms of really having any meat to it. So do you think, is this fixable? I mean, we have the resources absolutely Ely states in terms of the private sector, in terms of corporate capacity, but is it fixable from a policy perspective to kind of right the economic ship, or is that just?
I think the economic part of this equation is just much trickier to figure out. So in some ways, kudos to Ely for all the great work that he did when he was in government, for really getting all of America's allies on the same page in terms of a shared vision of what the challenge itself is. That was not the case a decade ago, but I think America's allies have come around, and in some ways, that's through a process of having everyone be at the table, and also the US doing a very good job listening itself. On the economic side, I think it's much trickier because there are a couple of different things that are at work, right? First of all, the scope of what constitutes dual use technology has really expanded. And so there's not necessarily a shared agreement as to what constitutes dual use, because those goalposts are changing at all times. But I think secondly, when it comes to this vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, that works if everyone agrees on a set of level playing field rules. And what we have is the one economic giant that operates under a very different system with distortions that have economic implications, which are to the benefit of some of those countries in the region in the near term, but may have security costs in the longer term, particularly when it comes to dual use competition. So I think that's the challenge writ large that we face. And then I think when it comes to the IPEF specifically, there are a set of fixed investments firms from all countries, including the United States in the region, have made. And to reconfigure those supply chains involves having winners and losers. And anytime that you have losers involved or making fixed cost investments, but then aren't going to reap the gains from that, that's a politically costly equation. But that has implications on the other side when it comes to jobs and others who are suffering from those distortions. And again, I don't think there's a shared vision on that front. So IPEF was an attempt to try to get to the same page on that. I think there was progress done when it comes to, say, energy, critical minerals, and so forth. But on the bigger questions that I just painted out, I'm not sure on the economic front, the US and its allies are on the same page, nor even within the United States, everyone is on the same page when you look at some of what's changed from the last administration to this one, or also at the differences within the Trump administration.
And I would just say, just to build on that, not to make a caricature of this issue, because it is incredibly complex and a lot was achieved on this, but one of the big shortcomings of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is that there was not a market access component to it. And so to put it sort of overly simplistically, the way our trade agreements have worked in the past is that we've used market access to the United States the way to drive rules and standards. And what IPEF was an attempt to drive the rules and standards without the market access. And the partners were sort of like, well, you're asking me to do really hard things without the benefits of that. So I think it comes back to this question. It's really a political question around what are the politics of free trade in Washington and the United States, and can we get back to a place where it's not a dirty word? I was working at the White House, as you mentioned, at the end of the Obama administration, when there was a final push on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It got pretty close. There was, I remember at the time, there was a war room in the West Wing of the White House where there were all the congressional districts up on the board and all the sticky notes, looked like, you know, out of some West Wing TV show kind of thing. And people thought there was a chance. And then all of a sudden you fast forward to the Democratic National Convention And you've got the big anti-TPP signs with the red line through it, and free trade is something that like thou shalt not be spoken. And so I think the question is there a political leader in the United States who can get back to thinking about we're not going to let the corporations run our foreign policy. It's not just going to be the banks. We're not going to decimate the middle class. But is there a way to engage with foreign markets in a way that's going to benefit the American people? And I hope we can get there, but it's going to require a little bit of political risk. But I think the reality is we're going to have to if we want to maintain our economic position.
You agree with that?
Yeah, if I can, I absolutely agree with that,
Me
right?
too.
I think, you put yourself in the shoes of any of our foreign negotiating partners, right? They're being asked to make difficult
Right.
trade-offs, and they need to show that there are gains to different constituencies.
Right.
Market access has traditionally been the way that they show that, right? And you can argue to say there are security gains, but those security gains are hypothetical because it's kind of like buying yourself insurance, right?
Exactly.
Whereas the market access is tangible
It is
to the
near
bottom
term.
line of certain constituencies in the near term. I think the tricky part, I'm gonna nerd out here a little bit, is, right, the United States is not per se opposed to market access, especially for our allies if we want to integrate these
Right.
together. But you have to make sure that those supply chains are resilient in the event of a conflict.
Right.
And you need to make sure that those who are distorting this market access doesn't serve as a backdoor for that. And there are legal ways by which we can do that. And when you sit down in the negotiating room, that's where we and our allies are on the same page, right? They want to still be able to source X% components from a partner that we would not necessarily see as trustworthy
Yep.
or as distorted. And we realize those shifts aren't going to happen overnight, but they do need to happen in order for this to serve both the economic and security gains. And so I think there needs to be a step up on political leadership in terms of how we message this. But there also needs to be a recognition on the part of our allies that they need to move on changing this. And in terms of how to do this technically, we all know how to do it. It's really a political will question.
And so just to follow up on that, Eli, so do you, to what extent, let's say the big pushes that you made, right, in the Pentagon, whether it's putting the Indo-Pacific to sort of its central place or others, to what extent is that sort of larger strategy, let's say even around this issue of market access, isn't interagency the biggest issue that you ran into in terms of a major blocks, or was it something Congress? How do you analyze that in terms of these big strategic shifts that you?
Yeah, so on this question of the integration of economics and security and strategy, I mean, hard to completely say without getting into very specific arguments, but I think there are layers of stakeholders in any of these issues that you're managing through. So one would obviously be the domestic political implications of anything that you're doing. And that's in some ways when you're working at the Pentagon and you're going to the sit room and you're engaging with folks on the National Security Council, you're not supposed to, and you're not arguing about domestic politics and whatnot, but it's certainly in the background, in the decision space that you have around some of these issues about whether it's on technology or trade, the space, investment restrictions and whatnot. The domestic politics are very much in the background, in the congressional politics as well. And then, of course, you have the economic agencies in the interagency context, that whether it's the Treasury Department, USTR, the Commerce Department, that in some cases will be allies, and you spend a lot of work building those alliances day to day. I often used to joke we spend more time in the U.S. government sort of battling the interagency than you do your adversaries in terms of how you're thinking about spending your time. But building those coalitions inside the government, you're working in the interagency context, and then obviously trying to align with the partners, and then some instances with the private sector as well. So it does become quite complex to do sort of big things like that. Yeah.
If switching in a way to China for a second, how did you think U.S. thinking about China, how did that evolve during your tenure? And sort of through to today, about a year later, and where do you see the biggest risk of miscalculation? And it could be cross straits, it could be something different area. Where are you most concerned about?
So again, it's a big question on it. If you're kind of tracing like the arc of the debate in Washington around the China issue, I guess I would say, without doing some big historical review here, you had a consensus around a conception of integration and engagement that was lasting for decade and a half plus at the beginning of the century that started to crack toward the end of the Obama administration. And then the first Trump administration shifted rhetorically in part to a conception of competition. I think where the Biden administration took over was that that conception of competition had been largely accepted sort of in a rhetorical sense or in a doctrinal sense, but it hadn't really been implemented and executed in a real way. And that a lot of what the Biden administration did on defense, on technology, on economics was about a more comprehensive implementation of a strategy of competition. Interestingly, I think the Trump administration has actually taken us off that track in a way that is surprising to some. I think some of the key features of the Trump administration is actually that, number one, there is no singular China policy nor is sort of a coherent theory of the case or strategy inside the Trump administration. There are a lot of different people with a lot of different perspectives, and they're all manifesting themselves at the same time. And people are kind of squinting, trying to understand, wait, what is the strategic approach here? And what it really is that there isn't a strategy. There are several strategies, and they're all kind of running in parallel at the same time. So there has not been a cohesion around the competition argument in a way that there was in the first Trump administration and the second and the Biden administration. And then on top of that, the China issue, from my perspective, has just been a much lower priority for the second Trump administration than people expected. If you look back on the 2016 campaign, recall Trump up on the stage, China, China, China. He used to say that over and over again. And his case against Hillary Clinton was about the hollowing out of factories in the Midwest. And it was a really prominent feature of his original political argument. And then COVID happened. And so by the end of his term, he had turned sort of very hawkish on China. He had this cadre of folks around him who were Mike Pompeo and Matt Pottinger and folks who were sort of part of that community and expecting that to come back in. It did not feature prominently in this last campaign. And then since he has come back in, it is, the issue of 10th most importance for this administration, from the Panama Canal to Greenland to Venezuela to Gaza to Yemen to Ukraine and obviously now Iran. And so I think folks have been expecting, hey, we sort of have an understanding of what this administration is going to do based on the first Trump one, and it has been very different. And so I think we're in an environment now, to your point about risks and challenges, is we have an administration that's doing two things at the same time that I actually think are really counterproductive and potentially destabilizing, which is, on the one hand, they are deprioritizing the Indo-Pacific and demonstrating less clear support for our allies and partners in the region. And then at the same time, appearing to take moves that are cozying up to Beijing and rolling back and postponing certain competitive actions that had been underway already. And so not only is the United States taking its foot off the gas of a more competitive posture toward Beijing, what they're signaling is to countries in the region to start questioning whether they should be doing that as well. Because if you're any country in the region, take Australia or a Southeast Asian country, and what you see is that the United States may not have your back if you're going to be taking competitive actions towards China, whether it's economic or security. And oh, by the way, not only is the United States not going to have your back, but the Trump administration is appearing to try to reap the benefits of economic engagement with China. Why wouldn't you do the same thing? In what world is a country going to take risk in their China policy if they don't think they're going to be in a context? So that's why I think there's a harmonious cycle, as Mark was describing, and I think we had this in part during the Biden administration, of rallying allies and partners who, when they're confident in the role of the United States, there is security and safety and collective response to some of the coercive and unfair, whether it's economic or security practices we're seeing from Beijing. But in the absence of that kind of US leadership, I think it's very hard to see the region coalescing in a way that is sufficient to push up back against that. So I think we're heading into a period here where the administration is going to have to put forward a more confident and concerted statement about its position in the region. Prime Minister Takaichi was just here last week from
That's where I
Japan.
was going.
That visit actually went pretty well. Good reaffirmation about the alliance. Of course, the Iran stuff is a huge shadow over all of that. But we're going to have to see more of that. And there's Taiwan colleagues here in the room. This administration has been very ambivalent about the relationship with Taiwan. And there have been signals of great support in arms sales and saying the right things at times. And then there have been moments of rolling back forms of support, canceling dialogues, canceling visits and trips, and questioning America's role in the region. And that sort of ambiguity, that kind of ambiguity, I think is not helpful and will lead to probing and testing from the PRC and a lack of alliance cohesion with partners. And those two things together could be really destabilizing.
It's interesting because, I mean, that's where my mind went as you're talking, which is, for me, it was really interesting to watch Japan and their prime minister basically state effectively an attack on Taiwan is an attack on Japan, effectively, right? Meaning that is a direct national security issue for Japan, right? Which is sort of obvious, but has never been explicitly laid out the way she laid it out.
Yeah.
How does that, to me, that is in some ways what the Trump administration is arguing for, right? So again, Steve Yates, to go back just to that kind of complimentary talk, yeah, he was saying that that's the goal. We're investing, we've got Pete Hegseth out there, he's in the region, but we're also asking for a lot of investment from our allies, and we want them to stand up and become normal nations, effective. One of the aspects of it.
Yep.
I think that's healthy. We think it's so. How does that, when you heard sort of that statement from Japan, how does that change, you think, the alliance, just the overall ecology of what the U.S. is trying to do? Right. In some ways, it could be viewed as a positive, right? Meaning this is going to be much more proactive Japan. A Japan that is now also has done a lot more work with South Korea in terms of certain standardization and kind of to even energy emergency response coordination. I mean, there's things happening between those two countries that historically were very hard to do. Partly, I think, because of what you're saying, partly the withdrawal, or at least perceived potential withdrawal of U.S. security guarantees in a way. So how do you, it's not all one-sided, right? You can see how, I see part of their argument.
No, I'm going to give him credit.
Right,
I'm going to give him credit.
What's your reaction?
Yeah,
There's some pretty big changes that are happening.
Yeah, and it's like some other things they're doing where there is a kernel of truth or a recognition of an imbalance that needed to be addressed. And yet the ways they've gone about it has been so horribly counterproductive.
So just talk a little.
But the root of the identification of the imbalance of our security partnerships and the need to rebalance those is something I fundamentally agree with. And we have alliance relationships in the Indo-Pacific that were built for a different era.
Exactly.
And were predicated on a bargain of the United States is going to defend you, and in exchange for that, you're going to keep borrowing dollars, and we're going to have economic and diplomatic friendship and positive relations and whatnot. And in the intervening period, those countries, many of them have become advanced democracies. They've got a lot of money, they've got more investments, and it's not fair that they're spending all their money on social programs and underspending on defense while we're carrying their security burden. So the need to rebalance that, both in defense spending, which has gotten a lot of attention, but also in roles and missions, which is what the Japan conversation is in part about, becomes very important. And that's something we had started to do during the Biden administration. I would say it is an area where we could have gone faster and done more, and was certainly on my priority list. And I think the Trump administration was right to take that on, to say, look, we're going to be looking for our allies to be spending more on defense and taking on larger roles. And that's important for a couple of reasons. It's important, number one, because in the absence of that, there are going to be questions about political sustainability. And people are going to be asking in the United States, why are my tax dollars going to defend that country if they're not spending money to defend themselves? So there's a political aspect to this. And then there's an operational and deterrence aspect where, given the nature of the China challenge, take a situation like Taiwan, deterrence with a capable Japan that may be participating in a convention is a different picture for Beijing.
That's what I'm getting at.
Absolutely. And so, yes, we want Japan to have the capability and the plans and the preparedness to be able to participate in a coalition setting in that context and in other contexts as well. And that's true for Australia and it's true for others. So the movement toward this is important, but the question is, how are you going to do that?
I got it.
And
that requires significant engagement.
and look, I'm not
right?
gonna,
To your
yeah,
point.
and I'm not gonna try to quote Steve Yates, but I spend a lot of time with Republican friends and colleagues, and what they say is, look, this was never gonna happen under business as usual.
Mhm.
You were gonna have to threaten and coerce these partners, and you're gonna have to rattle
That's
the
right, that's
cage
correct.
and
That is generally.
look at
yes.
what's
That's
happened
the
with
thesis.
NATO. And the problem is that if you do it in a way that leads to diversion in terms of the integration of the alliances and the political and the strategic relationship, then you may end up with a capable ally. We may end up with a capable Europe 10 years from now,
Yeah.
but if it's not integrated
Right.
with the United States strategically
Right.
or through an alliance
It'll have
structure, then
divergent interests,
yes.
obviously,
And
yeah.
so the challenge is, how do you do this in a
Yeah.
way that deepens integration rather than drives separation? And so I think the ways in which the Trump administration has been driving this in a very public way,
Yes.
right, is not always helpful for politicians who need to make arguments about spending more on defense. So I was just down in Australia just a few weeks ago. A lot of pressure on the Australian government to spend more on defense. The senior defense officials there are telling me, look, the more the Trump administration says out loud,
And we need to.
we want you to spend more on defense. The defense leaders in Australia want that too, but when they go into their internal debate within their own cabinet or publicly, and they make an argument for spending more on defense, what do you think they hear back? Well, you're just carrying America's water. You're just doing that because Trump's telling you to, and we have to stand up to him. And that was a decision to put them in that
Sure.
position. So number one, don't do that. You got to think about the domestic politics and create the political space for these leaders to make that decision. And number two, to get back where our conversation started, are you really going to ask these countries to spend more on defense when you're undercutting their economies with tariffs?
Yeah.
And can we have a security strategy that's aligned with our defense strategy? So if you go back to the Shangri-La dialogue last year, is the premier defense forum in the Indo-Pacific, where every year the Secretary of Defense gives what is really the principal authoritative statement about U.S. defense strategy in the region, and then sits down with the executive director of IISS for a conversation. Secretary Hegseth gave a speech, said all the right things, actually, sounded like a lot of continuity, sat down for a conversation and got this question. This was on the record. You can watch this on video. The question is sort of, what about all these tariffs? How is that sort of affecting your alliance relationships? And his answer was literally, quote unquote, I do tanks, not tariffs. And there have been defense officials going up to testify before Congress, getting the same question, how is this affecting your alliance? I'm not here to talk about tariffs. I'm here to talk about it. And the idea that those things are separate, and it's not just, on a stage in Singapore, in the actual process of the policy development, Mark's old friends who are now at USTR are going out and beating the crap out of our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, from Vietnam to elsewhere, with no regard for the actual relationship this has to our security strategy. And so yes, you have to take that into account, and what it should be is something that's much more integrated. So what we would need is a process that was pushing our allies. It's a long answer to your question, but it's a process of pushing our allies as hard as we can, but having the diplomatic and political savvy to create space for them to make the decisions we want to make rather than closing that off, and then having an integrated policy such that the rest of what you're doing on economics and trade and technology is reinforcing rather than undermining both the political as well as the bureaucratic momentum to make those changes. So I think that we've seen a lot of the former and the pressure and a lot of the latter in terms of the comprehensive approach you need to actually be effective. And I will say one last thing on this, which I think people often ask this question around, what's going to last out of Trumpism, which is sort of the impossible but most important question. But I think that one of the answers to that I'm relatively confident about is that this general line of argument that our allies and partners need to play a more sufficient role in our alliances. They need to be more balanced. That will endure, and you will be hearing that from Democrats. You will not be hearing Trump was all wrong about that, and we got to go back to America carrying the bag. So we've got to figure this piece out, and we got to do it in a way that's politically sustainable.
But then and then Mark, definitely jump in. But so from an IR, so as a well-trained Berkeley guy, from an IR theory perspective, in a way,
I mean, is that the end of US balancing in that sense and moving to simply deterrent? So we try to simplify, that was great. But then we try to project forward. Given that, do we think that fundamentally there is such a shift, bipartisan, in appetite for a fairly proactive US, that balancing stage is sort of over, offshore balance, that has been sort of the Bretton Woods security side strategy to an extent, or not? Or
We're gonna have a massive national debate over this in the next 24 months, and it's gonna be fascinating. And I hope everyone in this room plays a part in that discussion because there's a lot at stake. And
exactly.
I think there is, again, on the sort of what does the future look like, at least to the degree that I'm involved in a variety of discussions, bipartisan and also among the Democrats thinking about, what do we do if we get the chance? The sort of hit the go back button I don't think anyone thinks is an option. So looking forward, I think there are going to be real debates around American leadership, and America's role in the world, and America's forward deployed military presence. And we are going to need, from my perspective, leaders who are willing to make that argument in an environment where it's getting harder and harder, including in the wake of the Iran war. And one of the things that I'm worried about that I have already started seeing, and I hope does not metastasize, is that the lessons in the reaction to the war in Iran is going to amplify the, we're sick of this stuff. We do not need this sort of militarized foreign policy. We do not these sort of ideas about American leadership and America's role in the world. Let's spend that money at home. Let's come home. And when folks like myself or Mark or others are going to say, well, we've actually got some pretty important stakes in the Indo-Pacific, and American leadership there is really important. And we've got this challenge from the PRC. I think what you're going to hear from certain quarters is, oh, there they go again. There goes the Washington blob and the military industrial complex. They're just out for another bad guy, another boogeyman, and it is so frustrating to watch because having had to endure decades of America eroding its power and resources in strategic parts of the world, in Central Asia, in the Middle East, and then to have that affect people's appetite to engage in a world that actually matters for American security and prosperity, being the Indo-Pacific, is really frustrating. And so it's going to require what you're describing, Edward, is going to require folks to make a nuanced argument that basically says, yes, the excesses of the Trump administration, including in Iran, and obviously that's an unwritten story, were a mistake, but we do need American leadership, and the American military matters in this part of the world. And we're obviously not in a great environment of nuance right now, but we're going to have to thread that needle.
And deterrence is much cheaper than engagement post facto with threats, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
Which is a core, obviously. Okay, Mark, did you want to jump in a little?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I'll add is, you saw some version of this on the economic side in the first Trump administration. A lot of people in 2021 thought this was going to be a reset, and that wasn't the case. And so I agree with what Eli's saying. I think the same thing is playing now on a security side. And the more folks realize that that's playing out, that's important. But the economic analogy also holds in terms of there's still a debate going on as to where those priorities should be spent and how much should be on which portion of that strategy. And I think we're seeing that linked here on the security side as well.
Let me follow up, Mark, in a way. One of the things I love about what you do is, a lot of what you write about, teach, is sort of the W2, a little bit relates to exactly what Eli was saying. He's saying that the security architecture is well dated, is clearly dated, and that sort of post World War II is over, right? Similarly, you write about the same thing, that kind of the WTO centered model of economic interaction and engagement does not fit today's world, largely because of China and its approach to political economy, for that way, to sort of China Inc., to simplify. So does that mean, is the core problem really, from your perspective, sort of China versus the rules and the way the rules have been set up, or the fact that the US still, in many ways, hasn't built a real credible economic alternative, a proactive economic alternative, particularly when we're talking about the Asian region, right? That's a big question, but just
Yeah.
because you thought a lot about it, you write a lot about it. And the other thing is, by the way, the other big piece of this is, back to Taiwan in a ways, people here, like, I think it was Danny and others were sort of saying, look, at the end of the day, I mean, WTO, GATT, like maybe we're going back to a GATT world in the end of the day. So, I mean, you can there's ways that you can protect your markets. WTO is not about a pure free trade environment, and maybe we have to go back a bit to kind of original GATT kind of ethos, is I think kind of one of Danny's points. So
So,
don't throw it out.
no, so I think, the WTO is not disappearing, but the argument I've always made is it's becoming more like a normal international organization, which means its weight in terms of actually being able to adjudicate, be the central
Yes.
part, is declining, but it's important in terms of having a convening space, transparency, notifications and so forth. And it does play a role with common issues, let's say the fisheries agreement, right? Where there aren't as many security related elements. But I think at the end of the day, the Indo-Pacific is going to be the central part of economic growth, driving at least the first half of the 21st century. And in that region is an intense security competition of the form that Eli has been describing. And in that balance, your security is going to come first.
Yes.
That's the argument that I'm making. And so I think in that type of context, it's very hard to tie yourself to any rules that will possibly tie your hands when it comes to security implications. And then you throw the technology piece in play here, and that's a big wild card.
It is.
And so I think what that means is, by and large, we're going to see much more transactions-based, interest-based arrangements.
And so does that mean more, and which is, I think, what the Trump administration is doing, more bilateral, not FTAs, right? Not multilateral, more bilateral.
That's one possibility. I mean, if you ask me, my preference would be more mini-lateral, a sense about countries with shared interests doing that together, coalition-based. Those coalitions can even differ depending on the particular issue. But I think at the end of the day, those arrangements need to leave flexibility for countries to put their security interests in play and feel like those aren't going to be infringed upon.
Any comments on that before I open it up to them?
No, let's open it up.
Okay, let's open up to the group. That kind of clearly, that's a large buffet of topics, so we can jump at any of them. I'll look right there first. Yep. And just your name.
Wait for the microphone.
Oh, that's right, and microphone. We gotta wait for the microphone. Just so that we capture it on the recording.
Hello, yeah. Also, I don't know, but I'm not sure your microphones are being captured if you're trying to record them, so just flagging, it doesn't sound like they're on from here. Anyways, thank you for being here. My name is Michael Bosch. I'm a mid-career MPA here at the Harvard Kennedy School. I think, or I guess my question is, China hasn't, at least in my life, I'm 41, hasn't exhibited much in terms of direct military assertion in confrontation, but has done a variety of obviously covert things and then also export controls in a situation where, given in many cases for rare earths and critical minerals, where 70 to 95% of the refining are going through China. If they did a full export block of all of those things, what would Western countries do in that situation, given the impacts on all things military? Is that a declaration of war, or what does that look like from a response perspective? Because to me, that's the biggest threat.
Yeah, happy to. Well, the first thing you learn in government is never answer a hypothetical question, but I will do that since I'm not in government now.
Exactly.
But happy to hypothesize. So, a couple things. I guess first, I will not let the opportunity to pass. I guess I would disagree with your initial premise of the China not using its military in a very proactive, assertive way. I think what we have seen over the last 5+ but more than that years is that PLA is playing a much more central role in Chinese statecraft. And ask your friends from Taiwan here, if you had a heat map of PLA activity around Taiwan, it is thickening and thickening and thickening year by year, and it's not just in the Taiwan Strait, it's becoming a 360 problem, and that's true vis-a-vis the Philippines, not just in the South China Sea, but out on the east side of the Philippines as well, and vis-a-vis the US military and if you ask Japanese colleagues as well. So the Chinese military is now out there and they are acting, exercising and coercing on a day-to-day basis like never before. So that's a serious problem in and of itself. The question you're asking is obviously a central policy question. I mean, there's a hypothetical scenario of them taking a very extreme action, but there's the real world scenario that's happening right now, which is that leaders in Beijing realized that they have this point of leverage over the Trump administration, and back last April on Trump's Liberation Day, when he raised, if you'll recall, tariffs more over 50%, China responded with levies of their own and then imposing these kind of rare earth export controls. And that was the first time against the United States that they had used that so sort of publicly and forcefully. And I think the Trump administration concluded they retaliated back. If you recall, US tariffs went to like 140 something percent, but pretty quickly came back down in the context of this threat of rare earth restrictions that, as folks in here know, power everything from military technology to cell phones to cars and almost everything you do on a daily basis. And the Trump administration essentially concluded that China had escalation control over this issue. It spooked the administration, and since then they've kind of gone into this defensive crouch, and we've seen kind of one rolling back of competitive actions after another, and sort of a side effort to try to strengthen US resilience against that problem in the future so that we can get back to a more competitive position. I think what I would say about this in response to your question is two things. Number one, don't show up to a fight that you're not ready to fight for, right? And so one of the critiques of the tariff war is that what Trump did is used a very ineffective instrument that Beijing had been preparing for years, in a way, and had not rallied any kind of coalition to do that, in a way that it was very easy for the PRC to retaliate here and get them back down. So part of the effectiveness of the rare earth tool by Beijing was because the Trump administration wasn't prepared for the standoff that they got themselves into, and Trump just clearly backed down. There's no other way to tell that story. I think the other piece of this, though, is that the United States has a whole set in series of leverage points over Beijing. And this is an area where I don't think the Trump administration has done sufficient thinking or preparation around, such that the future is not just to try to get America out from under China's coercive capability on rare earths. It's for the United States to also, so it's not just about resilience and dependency. It's about the United States also having its own tools of leverage over Beijing. And it's not just military by any means, such that we can get back to a position of essentially mutual deterrence in this space of technological and economic competition, such that Beijing couldn't escalate in the way that you're describing. And this administration, at least from everything I've seen, has not done that in a very effective way. So I think the future, would it be an act of war? You know, it would be a very serious problem. I think but the ability of the United States to respond in an effective way is not just going to be with the military instrument, and the US government has to think about what can it hold at risk of interests of Beijing, such that Beijing's going to think twice about doing that. And that's going to be the unfortunate place of stability and mutual vulnerability, rather than somehow trying to solve for this problem.
Hello, I'm Ishi. I'm a first year master's student at Kennedy School, and I'm studying international development. So I know more economics. So I have two questions. So my first question is gonna be we talk about tariff war that is happening last year and beginning of this year. And the China reactions is what kind of the China reactions influence the alien dispute with the US and the other Asian Pacific countries? How this reactions influence the future buildings, like future bondings, like connections. And when you previously mentioned about the rebuild the connections or make it more stabilized, right? Like how this influence is gonna be. And my second question is I was curious about why Trump is not that emphasizing on the Asian Pacific as their priority. Like in economics, we assume people are rational, so I assume them are also rational. So I was wondering their rationalities behind them, what the thinking map they have behind. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on the tariffs and the link to security, right? You see two different types of effects, right? One effect is, of course, the US is a little bit less reliable of a partner, and therefore we need to open up and possibly consider alternatives. And so an example of a country that reacted in that way, I would say, is India. Right? India and China and the PRC had a live border skirmish. They were in a cold standoff. Despite all of that, right, the higher tariffs plus the other types of actions took what had been a very warm relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump and pushed Prime Minister Modi in a position towards some form of rapprochement towards the PRC. So I think that's one type of reaction that we saw. But I think the other type that you also saw were for countries that truly relied for security arrangement with the United States. They were the ones that perhaps were most willing to come to some form of a trade framework agreement with the United States. And I think tied to that is also the security economic linkages oftentimes have been thought about separately. And those conversations became much more integrated, including thinking about what types of investments are you going to make in the United States, how's that going to improve supply chain resiliency and so forth. So I don't think there's a one size fits all answer to the first part of your question, but I think it depended very much on your security arrangement with the United States and also to what extent you align on the scale and the nature of the threat that's being faced in the Indo-Pacific. Overall, though, I think it made everyone much more into I've got to hedge, the world is much more complicated type of scenario there.
And I mean, this prioritization question, I think I'm not gonna even try to make a real guess at exactly why the Trump administration has deprioritized the Indo-Pacific. I think there are questions around, if you talk to Republican strategists, let's get away from sort of what the Trump administration is doing, but if you talk to Republican strategists, there are different theories of the case about how the United States should be operating in the world right now. And there is a school of thought that, for instance, is described as sequencers of people who say the United States is facing a set of challenges around the world. We've got the predominant challenge in the Indo-Pacific from China. We've got these sort of secondary and tertiary challenges in Europe, in the Middle East, and that the United States cannot afford to compete in general, but also especially militarily with all these countries at the same time. And therefore, the appropriate strategy for the Trump administration was to try to settle the Europe issue, the Ukraine issue, to something that would reduce the burden and focus on the United States, find some way to put the Iran issue in the box, and then transition to a focus on the Indo-Pacific. And I think there's an idealized version of that some people think is underway. I think it's just a question of will they ever get there? Are they going to get out of whatever quagmire they're stepping into in Iran? And is there actually an end of the line in Ukraine that one could envision that would allow them to transition and focus? And the homeland part of that, and the Venezuela part of that, and the Caribbean part of that could be part of that story too, that the United States needs to focus on its home theater, and that will alleviate it to then focus on and be prepared for the dominant challenge. There's also, I would say, a set of theories around a notion of consolidation where, again, this is a little different than exactly what the Trump administration is doing, but the theorists and the strategists who are trying to put the pieces together on the Trump administration's approach, they're looking at the United States going through a period of some kind of rapprochement with the Russians and frankly with Beijing to a degree that we're seeing between Trump and Xi right now, and then using the interim to strengthen American power and resilience, whether that means, supercharging U.S. energy, strengthening the U.S. defense industrial base, dealing with some of these supply chain rare earth issues, and therefore kind of consolidating American power again and preparing America to actually compete with China in a way that if it sought to do so today, it would have these exposed vulnerabilities to the rare earth question that it's not prepared for. So those are kind of giving benefit of the doubt to a very chaotic. The answer is probably that there hasn't been a lot of thought to some very clear geopolitical approach here. But I think there are folks thinking through how do you take what the Trump administration is doing and then eventually get to a more competitive position in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's just right now, the drainage of resources and attention are happening at such an extreme rate elsewhere that it's really subtracting from the Indo-Pacific. So I don't know that they're going to ever get there, but there are folks who are thinking about how one might do that, but it certainly hasn't happened yet.
You just say a couple things before we turn to you on what you think some of the costs of that diversion and the use of all that military sort of equipment and what you talked about earlier.
Yeah, no, happy to. So, and I had a piece in the Washington Post last week on this if folks want a little bit more of the details, but there are essentially three things happening at the same time that if you look specifically at the war in Iran, but also more broadly at the way the United States has been using, the way the Trump administration has been using the US military over the last 16 months or so, which has been a very high tempo. If you look at it, not that it's been a bunch of wars all the time, but if you look at the tempo of the US military around the Venezuela operation, in the Middle East around the counter Houthi operation, some of the defense of Israel work, the original Iran strikes, et cetera. The US military has been on overdrive for the last several months. And now with the Iran war, there are three things happening that are concerning to this question of US readiness in the Indo-Pacific. The first is just the literal diversion of resources to the Middle East. So currently there is no aircraft carrier deployed in the Indo-Pacific, as there should be. Those have now sailed from the Indo-Pacific over the Middle East. The Pentagon is pulling missile defense capabilities and other kind of counter-air capabilities out of places like Korea, the THAAD system to go to the Middle East. There have been other diversions of other types of what's known as ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft moved to the Middle East. So you have literal capabilities that have moved. More important than that, you have what folks talk about under this term readiness, which is the wear and tear on the US military. If you think about it like a car or your own body, if you use it at too high a tempo for too long, things are going to start wearing down and breaking. And so the US military has a normal deployment schedule for its capabilities. It has repair and maintenance schedules, not to mention deployments for the troops themselves, for training and rest and whatnot. And all of those things are being strained such that the readiness of the US military for what it needs to do potentially in the Indo-Pacific is being drained in terms of the capability that could be brought to bear at any time. One of the headline pieces of that has been the expenditure of missiles and munitions and interceptors for drones and ballistic missiles, of which there is a limited supply. And we've been just using them up, whether it's in the Middle East or elsewhere at a pretty high rate. So there's the diversion, there's the wear and tear, and then there's just the strategic distraction problem where in order to execute the kind of coordinated and synchronized interagency process that would be an idealized China competition strategy, you need some pretty focused senior officials spending a lot of time on these issues. And I don't have access to Marco Rubio's calendar or Secretary Hegseth's calendar, but the amount of time that they're spending on a daily basis on the Indo-Pacific versus the Western Hemisphere or the Middle East or Europe for that matter, I imagine is fractional. And that's a real problem. And if things go downhill in Iran, that problem is only going to get a lot worse. And the region is certainly familiar with that phenomenon after wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So you've got the resources and the attention problem, and really challenges the ability of the U.S. to harness the attention and urgency it needs for the region.
That's great. I haven't read this. I will. Also, I'm sure we potentially have Cuba on deck next. So there's many potential new issues that are being on the plate. Yes.
Great.
Hi Bart, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kathy. I'm a first year master's student here at the Kennedy School, focusing on diplomacy in the Asia-Pacific. I wanted to just come back to the economic piece of the US Indo-Pacific strategy for a second. As the US steps back from pursuing multilateral trade frameworks, and focusing on other regions, it's given Asian economies a chance to pursue new partnerships, and to reshape the regional architecture. I want to ask, how consequential do you think is that absence? And how does the administration weigh its trade priorities against this need to further economic partnership in the region?
Yeah, so, and I assume when you ask, you're talking about the Trump administration, right? So let me focus on this. So I think one of the points that is gone underappreciated is that actually the Trump administration has been quite engaged at the WTO itself. Whereas there was a review of the US's role in international organizations and so forth, the Trump administration was very fast to appoint a deputy USTR who serves as the WTO ambassador. The Trump administration paid the dues at the WTO. The Trump administration has put forward a WTO reform proposal, has been really actively engaged, including calling into question one of the traditional premises about most favored nation having to rethink that. So I want to give the Trump administration credit for continuing to engage in trying to reform what I think I and others, no matter which side you fall on the aisle of this, right, that multilateral architecture is outdated, and they are trying to work to do that. I skeptical, and I think many people in Trump administration are perhaps skeptical about whether or not that effort is going to bear out. But at the very least, they're at the table and they're not acquiescing that space at the table, giving that space up to others. I think when it comes to the regional architecture, yes, you have these agreements, right? RCEP, CPTPP, and so forth. But I think the view is that those agreements are not necessarily security enhancing for the countries that are involved in those. And so the view is, unless something like CPTPP is redesigned in a way that it would further security interests, it doesn't necessarily make sense for the United States to take part in those types of arrangements. Whether other countries believe that's the case, that's up to them to decide. But when I chat privately with officials from those other countries, I don't think they believe that that's the case per se as well. They just think that the probability of conflict is much lower, so they're not willing to bear the economic cost of that, or the political cost of, right, having to address that. So, and I think that's the difference of opinion there, but I don't necessarily see that as a loss of leadership for the United States, particularly on the security domain, if you can't make the case that those arrangements are actually security enhancing. Do I think that on digital issues or things like that, you could be opening yourself up to vulnerability? I think absolutely yes. And so those are some open questions that are left for countries in the region to decide. But I think the approach this administration takes is to say, if you want market access to the United States at certain rates, you need to make these types of changes. And it's just choosing to do so in a much more bilateral engagement manner.
Maybe just building on that, because I think, at least as I interpret part of your question there is a phenomenon of in the trade space, also in the security space, of Asian partners, frankly, global partners as well, but seeking alternatives to the United States in certain areas, or wanting to diversify their relationships. And that's manifesting in more bridge building between US partners, say between the EU and India or whatnot, new agreements in that regard. And if the question is that good or bad for the United States? The answer is really it depends. And it's true in the security space as well, where I think one of the very important phenomena over the last decade, but really the last 5 years, has been much more intra-Asia deepening security cooperation between US allies and US partners. And from my perspective, that's been great. And if Japan and Australia want to deepen their security partnerships, or the Philippines with Japan, if that is done in a certain way that allows the United States to then build upon and enhance those relationships, that's really good. And so I think what we need to do is watch these, though, because if there's an alternative scenario where if you take any one of these countries, whether it's Singapore, Australia, European partners, South Korea, or others, these countries have, like everybody, limited resources and limited political bandwidth. So if their answer is, we're less comfortable deepening our partnership with the United States right now, and therefore we are going to go to alternative country X, and they're going to be buying potentially military systems that aren't interoperable with the United States, or they're engaging in certain types of defense dialogues that are taking opportunities away to do that kind of diplomacy with the United States, then that's going to matter. And so I think that, as a phenomenon, it's a good thing. It gets back to sort of the conversation about the importance of integration here. That's okay if these countries are diversifying their relationships. In fact, I think it's a good thing for the United States, but we still want it to be done in a way that U.S. alliances can leverage those capabilities in an effective way. And for instance, the direction that the Europeans are headed in right now, I don't think that's surely the case. And so, again, as we were talking earlier on the defense spending, we want Japan to be spending more on defense, right? That's a good thing. But there's more than two, but there's two sort of caricature futures of one in which that defense spending goes toward capabilities that are, for the most part, very much going to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. And then there's another future in which those investments are going toward things that are Japan building redundancy and autonomy and independence and sovereignty because it's concerned about over-reliance on the United States. So the United States staying in this game and being seen as a reliable partner is really important to lead to that first one. And the same goes for these sort of connections between our allies. It can be a good thing if it can be built upon.
Can you speak a little more on Europe, on your question? Like, what do you mean by Europe not necessarily going in the direction? So,
Well, I think the conversation in Europe right now is about sovereignty as it relates to defense issues, and they're aiming to spend huge amounts of money on defense. If you look at Germany, for instance, just dramatic increases, the kinds of things Trump has been calling for and others have been calling for a long time. They're finally doing it, but they're also doing it in a way that at times is saying, we're going to do it, but we're not going to spend that money on European kit on American systems and companies unless we absolutely have to. There are areas where there are not European alternatives.
yeah, I see.
But if they do it in a way that's sort of Europe first and not with the United States, not toward a mind toward this question of interoperability, then it's going to be a problem, because then if the result of that is that
Less cooperation.
and they're doing it because it's going to afford them more independence in decision making, some degree of that is natural and fine. But if it becomes as sort of an alternative actor in international security, I don't think that's good for the US and it's not good for Europe. So you've got to find a way to maintain sort of a US foothold in the military modernization of Europe. But the politics are kind of heading in the opposite direction.
So let me start here and then go left.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting discussion. I'm Hannes, I'm a CAE PhD fellow. We talked a lot about China and the US today. Could you tell us your thoughts? What's the role, for example, of India, especially in this situation? Thank you very much.
Yeah, very, very, very important. And as Mark was describing, the U.S. relationship with India has taken several steps backwards. So I'm not going to speak to necessarily how the Trump administration views this, but at least at my time in the Pentagon, I think I believe two things were true. I believed that India needed the United States for India to achieve its national aspirations, and that the United States needed India to achieve its aspirations in the Indo-Pacific. So there is a mutuality of national interest. That being said, for anyone who has spent any time working on the India account or Indian foreign policy, India is not Australia or Japan. It is a country who has aspirations for hegemony in its region in South Asia, who wants a multipolar world, which also includes the United States not being the dominant power. And it's a country who has very much a developing world mindset as a major thrust of their orientation to the world. All that being said, they also have a side to their foreign policy that is about being a democracy and aligning on certain issues with the United States and other democratic partners. And they certainly feel the economic and security challenge from China as well, which animates that. So I think the upshot of all of that together is that India is an essential partner for the United States in the Indo-Pacific, but the degree of aspiration and the expectation is not going to be, hey, we need to like flip India into an ally like Australia or Japan. That's just not going to happen. And so it's in part becoming comfortable with and tolerant of the degree to which India has this multidimensional foreign policy where it has relationships with Russia and it has relationships with Iran, and it goes to the BRICS summits, and it's going to have a face at the UN that looks a lot more like China than it does the United States, but understand that underneath all of that, from an economic perspective, a technology perspective, and a security perspective, from the US position, they're a really important partner. And it's been, as I mentioned, frustrating to watch because there was a massive amount of investment strengthening the US-India relationship over the last several years. And I think a lot of trust has been deeply undermined by the actions of the Trump administration, where things are maybe getting back on track a little bit, but I worry that it's going to be a little bit more in a business as usual, steady as you go kind of relationship, and without the kind of big ambitious projects that we're going to need to be doing together. I think that's going to be harder now, given in some ways, to the extent that there were skeptics in Delhi about their own bet on the United States, and voices always saying, we don't want to go too far with the United States. We can't trust them. We never know what they're going to do. I think a lot of what's happened over the last year has validated that America skepticism in a way that's going to take a lot of time to repair. And that's really unfortunate given the investment heretofore. But I also think, speaking for the community of people that I work with in Washington, all think that the time and energy and sweat and tears of the Indian relationship are worth it. So I think that will remain a long-term bet, but it's getting harder based on what this administration is doing.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm Keita Benjo. I'm MVP first year student at HKS. Before this, I was working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, and my job was about Japan-US security cooperation and alliances. So I'm so excited to hear your opinion on Japan-US alliance today. And I would like to hear more about your thoughts on what do you think Japan should focus on for its defense strategy. So do you think that Japan should focus more on enhancing the interoperability between JSDF and US military, or multilateral, unilateral cooperation, including the other country? Or there's a rising argument around whether Japan should possess its nuclear weapons or not. And I see the similar arguments in South Korea too. So also I want to hear your thoughts on this too. Thank you.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So first thing to say, Japan is the United States' most important ally in the world, full stop. Full stop. And I know not everyone's going to agree with that statement, but if you look at the nature of international security, the challenges that the United States faces, and the role that a number of partners can play around the world, none are more as important as Japan. So nurturing and strengthening that relationship should be among the top priorities of U.S. foreign policy. So it's very, very important. Point number one. In terms of what Japan should do in terms of its military modernization, I think, frankly, Prime Minister Takaichi is moving in several of the right directions. So Japan needs to spend more on defense. Absolutely. It's a rich country. It needs to be more capable from a military perspective. I think it should spend money on conventional capabilities that can contribute to the strength of the alliance. I don't think we are in a situation right now where Japan ought to move toward nuclear weapons, so we can talk about that because it's important, especially in the Korea context. But number three, I think one of the other areas where the Trump administration has maybe put the spotlight in the wrong direction has been around this question of defense spending as a percentage of GDP. In many of our alliance partnerships, it's been sort of the singular metric upon which a country demonstrates, whether it's being a good ally or not, and whether it's jumping over a bar of 3.5% or 5% of GDP for defense spending. The resource question is important, but to me and in the Japan context, the roles and missions question is much more important. And so what I think Japan needs to be doing is going through both the military operational and planning requirements, as well as the political and legal requirements to allow the SDF to be operating in roles and missions beyond just the defense of Japan and being a more integrated alliance partner throughout the Indo-Pacific. And I think that will be really important. And then finally, Japan, I know, is trying to build its own defense industrial base up to be stronger. That's really important because the United States is not, from a deterrence perspective and a warfighting perspective, the US defense industrial base alone is going to be insufficient. So part of what we are doing is we need to grow the pie of a collective defense industrial base to be able to have the kind of what military folks refer to as capacity, sort of the numbers of capabilities to, in the first instance, strengthen deterrence and then use those capabilities if we need them. And Japan can play a huge role in that. And where Japan is now compared to where it could be in terms of being a provider to that defense industrial base, there's a lot of space to go there. But to do that, again, it's a matter of domestic law, as you know well, also foreign policy. And Japan is going to need to become, in part, a net security provider in the region, and has started doing this as it relates to Australia, Taiwan, Philippines, and others. But I think the vision of the future that I would paint, putting that all together, is that you have a much more capable Japan. It's integrated in a much stronger alliance with the United States. It's playing a much broader set of roles and missions around the region that's strengthening deterrence, and it's a net security provider to other parts of the region, such that countries in South Asia or Southeast Asia or even Europe are benefiting from Japanese technology and capability in an alliance fashion. And I think if we do all that, then I think we are in a position to maintain peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. And I think in the absence of that, if Japan is not playing that role, it's just the United States playing pickup ball with other allies, I think it's going to be really hard. So this is a really pivotal moment for Japan and for the Prime Minister, and we'll see how far she can get.
I should just ask you a little bit on the nuclear. I mean, from the US perspective, with US interest, nuclear latency acceptable versus nuclear explicit capacities in terms of weapons? I mean, how do you view, what are your thoughts? I'm something I'm deeply interested in.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question, and I'm going to give you a Washington answer to this, which is that to not exactly answer the question, because the problem, so what is the problem?
Yeah.
And this existed during the Biden administration, so it's not just a Trump administration problem. The problem is that potential adversaries, North Korea in particular, and including China, that's now engaging in an extraordinary buildup of its nuclear forces, are challenging the credibility of the US extended nuclear deterrent and commitment in a way that, again, even during the Biden administration, the most alliance-friendly US government you could ever imagine, South Korea was still coming. And I spent a lot of time on this with the Koreans every day. We need more reassurance, more reassurance, more reassurance. We set up dialogue, site visits, tabletop exercises, all sorts of planning and integration efforts to try to reassure South Korea around the credibility of the US nuclear deterrent. And now we have the Trump administration, which is paying less attention to the region, potentially cozying up to Beijing. Who knows what they're going to do with North Korea. And then also, we haven't talked about the alliance with the Koreans, essentially calling upon the South Koreans, where we have right now a very integrated combined forces command there, for the South Koreans to be playing a more dominant role in conventional deterrence against North Korea, to loosen up and free up US forces to do other things in the region. So we are actually like very publicly winding out of our conventional deterrence role on the Korean Peninsula, saying we're going to maintain our extended deterrent. But if you're sitting in Seoul and you see the capabilities growing in North Korea and China, you see what the Trump administration is doing in the region, and they're doing this on the peninsula vis-a-vis the US presence, you might be worried about the sustainability of US commitment of the extended deterrent. So this issue is very live in South Korea.
Yeah.
It's sort of surprisingly emergent in Japan. I was at a conference in Tokyo, a senior level conference in November, and there was a let's say unnamed Japanese official who was speaking in Japanese, so I had my earpiece in, and he said something in passing about nuclear weapons. I had to take it out of my ear and say to the person next to me, did I hear that right? Did he just say that? Because 5 years ago, you never, ever, ever would have heard even this question we're getting here, right? It was sort of understood as absolutely not permitted to even discuss in Japan. I don't think it's like on the front burner. So things are changing very quickly. And Edward, to your question, the answer is, I don't know what actually the right policy options are yet, because US policy up until this point on these questions has been, the policy is non-proliferation and the door is shut.
Yeah.
And the answer is to strengthen the credibility of the US extended deterrence
Oh, we're not
commitment.
doing that.
And that was it. And it was, and that field of arms control in these questions was really dominated by the non-proliferation community, both the expert community and within the US bureaucracy, whose natural instinct is, again, like, that's an interesting question about latency. Our policy is non-proliferation, and we're going to find ways to strengthen. And sort of, and so I think that, but it's a good question, because again, for like so much of international security and international politics now, it's all on the table now. And I really truly believe that for probably the next US administration, Democrat or Republican, they're going to really have to be grappling with this question of ally proliferation. And what are you going to do about it? Are there policy solutions of, well, maybe latency, or maybe we're going to forward deploy US nuclear weapons, or are we going to sanction and try to isolate and punish our partners and if they move in this direction? Or are we going to try to accept it and support it, but do it in a way that prevents some kind of nuclear cascade around the world? And at least from my perspective in the Washington policy community, these issues are so nascent that they have not gotten the treatment of, okay, what actually are the options? What would it actually look like? And there are very new, whether it's sort of track 2 dialogues or studies looking at these questions, but it is a wide open space for great new ideas. I'm interested in doing some of that work myself, but look forward to reading the important research coming out of the Harvard Kennedy School, answering this question about what the options are. But we don't know yet, because I would just say finally, the expert field, I don't think has done a good job of laying out, much less engaging with the allies up to this point, but it has to start now.
Great answer. That's a good answer. That was not a non-answer. We have 1.5 minutes. Yes, sorry.
Thank you so much for your time. My name is Sargan, and I'm a first-year MPP student here at Harvard.
Most importantly, she's one of my RAs, as is Jake.
Favorite part.
I'm sure it's a joy for you every day.
Love it.
Okay.
I wanted to go back to one of the first things that you mentioned about this lack of coordination between the economic security and national security under this current administration, and just ask if you had any thoughts or saw any windows of opportunity to try and bridge that convergence. I'm thinking specifically around maybe AI or climate or anything else that you might be thinking about, if there's a way that you're seeing right now to bridge that divergence that we're seeing.
Well, for this administration, I think it's going to be hard. And just to get back to that initial point, to maybe be a little more concrete about it, and I was being a little glib about Secretary Hegseth's comments, but the reason why that matters is because when these decisions are being made under a normal interagency process, which is not occurring right now in the White House, what would happen normally around these tariff issues or export control issues is that the National Security Council would convene a meeting, whether it's at the level of the National Security Advisor, or the Deputy National Security Advisor, or the Senior Director who's in charge of that issue, which is the level that I was operating at from the Pentagon, and there would be a debate. And the economic agencies would come to the table and they would say, here's what we think is the right thing to do from the perspective of the Treasury Department or the Commerce Department. And in my seat, representing the Pentagon, I would say, well, that's very interesting, but actually we have these national security priorities and therefore we need to, and it is that push and pull, and sometimes it's going to end up on this side and sometimes it's going to end up on this, but it's that push and pull that develops that kind of more integrated, nuanced relationship. And man, I haven't heard anybody tell me that Secretary Hegseth is in the room when the Treasury Secretary and the Commerce Secretary or the USTR get together to devise strategy on tariffs, nor is it clear that Secretary of War is interested in being in the room for those conversations. So I think the Pentagon has a really important role of putting the national security issues front and center and providing a balance to just whatever's good for prosperity in US business. And so to the extent that that's not happening, it's a real problem. I don't know that there's like, from a US government process perspective, maybe AI is an area where the DoD stakeholders are playing a significant role alongside some of the economic policymakers, but from a process perspective, it's not happening in a traditional integrated way where you have lower levels working on options and decisions and kind of moving those up the tree and down the tree. And I think frankly, the pressure around these issues is probably going to have to come from Congress and from outside of the administration around some of the security elements of the economic issues to provide a lot of weight. But Mark, I don't know what your view is on how to reknit this back together.
No, I think part of it is also there's a debate within the administration itself, right? And so what Eli mentioned is on different policies, different people are taking the lead on it. You know, we're not being read into those. So one hopes perhaps there's a little bit more coordination that appears on the surface on that. But I think that's some of what you're seeing here as well.
Thank you to all of you for coming. I think to me, these discussions are what make this institution so great. And please join me in thanking Eli and Mark.